I think we have gathered, so let's resume. Let's resume by summarizing the third wave of non-trivial self-replicators. So essentially, it's a bit of a bold claim to say that these constructions are not construction universal or computationally universal, but it is fair to say that if you read the papers, it is not really the emphasis of the papers to analyze that or to argue for why that should be the case. And even though these examples are extremely interesting, I feel like the fact that essentially construction universality is to this day the only known, let's say, sufficient condition for a self-replicator to be evolvable. If this particular property is not discussed, whether these self-replicators can evolve and have different shapes potentially in the future, it seems to be like an important property of life missing. So here I'm just paraphrasing the definition of life by NASA. So it not only has to self-propagate, but it has to be able to undergo some adaptive evolution. And for these examples, it is not a priori clear that this is the case. But the constructions were, or like this is not where we stop. There are later works that do address this issue and try to, let's say, introduce self-replicating constructions that are able to evolve, and then we can study what is the dynamics, what kind of behavior do they develop, and it becomes extremely interesting. So here I will just mention three very famous examples. The design of evoloops by Hiroki Sayama, which is again a cellular automaton design. We can again quickly see it in action. So essentially, similar principle as Langton's, except for now, if a particular loop's construction arm collides with another loop, the loop is able to die, or it's able to dissolve itself and just leave some debris behind. So this is one upgrade of the functionality of Langton's. And the other one is that if two constructing arms collide, they can modify the genome that they carry through them, which can potentially result in an offspring with a different phenotype. So if we actually run this, first there's no collisions, so everything seems pretty regular, but as they start appearing, you will see that there will be loops of different shapes forming. So there is region of tiny loops that replicate faster, so they are more successful. And it's super fascinating. But it is rarely the case that there would be a region of loops that actually grow in size. And even though there has been a careful analysis of this later, and it can happen, it seems to be only temporary. So it is still not clear whether the system could really develop offsprings of higher and higher size or complication. So this is a cellular automaton example. And then two very notable ones are actually examples of self-replicating programs. So essentially, we're kind of circling back to where we started. So maybe let's talk a bit more about Tierra, which is, who here has heard of Tierra? It's a pretty iconic A-life example developed by an evolutionary biologist, Thomas Ray. Who essentially was troubled by the fact that he can only study one example of life, that is the life of Earth, and it evolves very slowly. So how can we design some artificial system which evolves, let's say, faster? So we can study evolution through more examples. And he, in collaboration with computer scientists, developed this esoteric programming language, which consists of 32 instructions. He called it the Tierran. And essentially, how does this world look like? Essentially, each organism is just a program. So it is a sequence of instructions from this programming language. And these programs live in one part of, let's say, the memory of the computer, some virtual environment, which is essentially like a one-dimensional world. Each organism has its own virtual CPU, which consists of an instruction pointer, which essentially points at which instruction is being executed, and unless there is some jump instruction, it just keeps on incrementing. And internally, the CPU has some registers and stacks. It can, for instance, store 2 different addresses, some address A and B, which encodes 2 locations on this memory. And then there are some instructions that essentially information can be moved between these 2 addresses and so on. And essentially what he does is he initiates this world with a single organism that he carefully handcrafted, which is essentially a quine with respect to this programming language. So if it gets executed, it first allocates a chunk of memory, so it has some writing, so it has rights to write at a particular other part of this, let's say, one-dimensional world, and it allocates an exact chunk of its own length, and then it just copies it instruction by instruction, the whole code into it. Once this is done, let's say the physics of this world will automatically spawn a new virtual CPU for this new creature, and now this new creature can also do things. So this world is simulating parallelism by essentially let's say, iterating between the instructions of each organism and going through them. Like in every cycle, let's say, 1 instruction from every organism gets executed. So there are some random mutations introduced into the system. So a particular operation can be, let's say, mutated with some non-zero probability. There is some death introduced into this world. So if a particular organism is not a very successful code and it produces a lot of errors during its execution, it's gonna be a good candidate for dying. So there is, let's say, some list of organisms prioritized by how successful they are, and the least successful die. And as such, essentially Ray can visualize what is happening to the populations of programs, and it's extremely interesting. They develop some pretty interesting behavior as they interact. So I forgot which color is which, but let's say after a while there is some basic parasites that essentially learn to use a part of the code of its neighbors to, let's say, execute them in order to replicate themselves. So they are essentially just partial short programs that use other programs' codes. I think these are the red ones, and after a while these are overtaken by these hosts that actually exploit the parasites, and they, as the parasite is trying to steal the information from them, they actually steal their virtual CPU, and suddenly they have 2 CPUs to replicate faster. So this is really like a pretty intriguing system to observe. And let's say more modern version of this is Avida, which is also based on self-replicating programs. But now the world has a specific fitness function. You can choose from a wide range of fitness functions, but typically the programs are encouraged to solve some computational tasks, like some basic logical operations, and the ones that are most successful, they get more CPU time. And this is, let's say, more of an environment to where you have control about what kind of functionality is being developed, and you can kind of study how is it being developed through the interactions of the programs. But having a particular fitness function, let's say, puts some artificial cap on what kind of behavior you can see, right? Because there is some convergence towards that behavior. And this brings us to the, let's say, last philosophical intermezzo. We are preparing with Jordan Kotler a Socratic dialogue that I will put into the notes. So now I will have to have a Socratic monologue about this, or we can have a discussion if you prefer. And essentially, it deals with the following question. We started with quines, and now we are suddenly seeing worlds where quines are the basic organisms that self-replicate. So the deep question is, are quines genuine self-replicators, or are there something a bit less? Or in other words, why did von Neumann go through the trouble of his very complicated constructions if quines were already full-fledged self-replicators in some sense? So it's interesting because if I talk to people about this at conferences, everyone seems to have a very strong opinion, and it is really either or. So some people do think that quines are full-fledged self-replicators in some sense, and some people do think that the cellular automaton self-replicators are something more. In some sense, one result that should end this dispute in some sense is the former result that Turing completeness does not imply non-trivial self-replication, because every Turing complete system does have quines, but if every Turing complete system does not necessarily accommodate for non-trivial self-replication, it means that quines sometimes should not be full-fledged self-replicators. So, just out of curiosity, who here seems to think that von Neumann's construction shows something much more than what quines do? That's not so many hands. Okay, so who here thinks that quines are already full-fledged self-replicators? Who here is confused? Perfect, yes, it takes it takes a while. I will try to provide, let's say, my personal insights, which are still not completely formal, but hopefully they will show something. So let's say we have a universal Turing machine U, which has some states, some tape symbols, and some update function. And we know, we have a guarantee from Kleen's recursion theorems that there exists some quine for it. So what does it mean if we put this description of this quine on the tape and we initialize the Turing machine to be in the initial state and reading the first symbol of the quine? After a series of time steps of this computational process, there will be 2 quines on the tape. So that sounds like a pretty nice self-replication. But the problem that is, let's say, behind all of this is that it is not the case that this new quine has the head pointed at its first location in the initial state. Actually, the computation halted, and we have now the Turing machine's head being in the halting state at the end of the tape. So in some sense, you could argue that this is not full-fledged self-replication because this quine does not now have the same capability as the original quine. It does not have the capability to self-replicate. It cannot somehow tell the Turing machine, please re-enter your initial state so I can also self-replicate. This is somehow not within the expressive power of it. So in the purest form of how we discussed quines, it seems that they are not exact self-replicators because the offspring does not have the capacity to self-replicate. So one more thing is there is a natural way to see the Turing machine or this computational process as a dynamical system. So essentially each iteration is, let's say, one application of some function to the contents of the tape. And now you could say, well, in this exact form, no, but there is a very straightforward modification of how I can make it into a full-fledged self-replicator, right? I can essentially just very mildly tweak the physics, or let's say the update function of this dynamical system, such that after the self-replication is over and the system is in the halting state, it will now by itself, this is, let's say, the laws of physics of this world, it's gonna spawn, it's gonna, let's say, traverse back, get to the first state of the quine, transition into the initial state, and then traverse even more and spawn another head with another initial state. And now we suddenly have full-fledged self-replication, right? We have 2 organisms exactly the same as the first one, and they are ready to self-replicate. So the philosophical question, which is very nuanced, is what constitutes this dynamical system? Or what is the state space and what is the physics? And one point of view is to say that the state of the system is just the tape. This is what you observe as you watch the computational process. And then the physics includes the state about the Turing machine head, its position, and so on. So, and the other one is, let's say, the one that seems a bit more natural to me is to actually include the state of the head and its position explicitly into the state space of the world. Why does it feel more natural? Where the Turing machine's dynamics is a deterministic dynamics, and if we suddenly forget about the position of the head and its state, and we only watch the tape, it's a pretty, like we don't know what is the next state of the system unless we are provided with this extra information. So it just, if we want to compare constructions in cellular automata of self-replicators and self-replicators of Turing machines, it would be nice to put them on the same ground and consider dynamics which are in both cases discrete dynamical systems. So it seems, or this is, let's say, the philosophical argument I'm making, is to me it seems more natural to explicitate the head, its position and its state as a part of the world. And when we do that, we actually have a pretty nice analogy between self-replication of these quines, biological self-replication and self-replication of cellular automata. In both cases, we have some underlying laws of physics. Here it is essentially the update rule of the Turing machine. Here it is our laws of physics. And here it is the cellular automaton update rule. And then within the world itself, we have a self-replicator that in each case consists of two parts. An informational part, which encodes the description of the organism. So here it could be the DNA. In the von Neumann self-replicator, it is the tape containing the description. And in the Turing machine self-replication case, it is the actual content of the tape, that is the description of the quine. But all of these replicators also contain the machine, or let's say the means that act upon this information. So this is the actual design, this is the actual machine we have constructed in the von Neumann's case. This is, let's say, the machinery of the cell in the biological case, for instance, ribosomes and many more. And here in the Turing machine case, it is the actual head that is the only thing that can essentially move around, change its state, and act upon the data. And when we put the three systems on the same ground, it does seem that the von Neumann's construction, as well as biological self-replication, elucidates something more than the replication of Turing machines. So just a side remark is if we look at it this way, like a quine having explicitly a head that produces another quine, and then somehow automatically we get spawned a new head with a new initial state. This is exactly what Tierra does, right? There is the replication of the program, and as soon as it's done, it gets spawned its own virtual CPU. Good. So let's look back at this trivial case of self-replication, which did not elucidate anything, neither about how information gets replicated, nor about how the means or the machine gets replicated. We just kind of hard-coded everything into the CA, and we don't have any insight from this, because we essentially just say, in the next time step, spawn a completely the same organism in this cell, right? This is not what's happening in these cases. They are all cases of some non-trivial self-replication, because we actually talk about what is the logical organization needed for both the informational layer and the functional layer to self-replicate. But the difference is that in the VNSR model or in the biological model, it is both the means and the information that are built from some more elementary parts, and it is both, let's say, elucidating something about how these elementary parts need to be organized and what is the interplay between this means and this information that leads to a full cycle of self-replication. But I would dare to argue that in the case of Turing machines, it only explains one half of the problem. So the quine elucidates completely what do we need to have this self-referential program that once it's being executed by this particular Turing machine produces the exact same information content, but when it comes to the copying of the actual means, we essentially hard-code it into the physics of the system, and we essentially say, once the informational layer is complete, just spawn a completely new means on the new organism. So this is, I think, what is the difference, or where I see the difference, is quines explain the informational layer of self-replication. But if we want to have them in a world that is truly self-replicating, somehow the means and how they get self-replicated is hard-coded, and we don't have much insight in how the means can also reproduce. Whereas both biological replication and the one in cellular automata explicitate that. How do you feel? Is it clear or less clear? Who thinks that they gain some insight from this? Okay, it's non-zero, so I consider this a success. I really encourage you to think about this on your own. If there is someone who has a strong claim for why there is no difference between self-replicating quines and the VNSR construction, speak now. I'd be super curious, just to, or speak to me later, or send me an email. This is just,
I have no claim, but do you know of some things that, some claim that someone else made in favor of the fact that they're the same?
It would be amazing to have such an exemplar in the room so we could have the dialogue. But I have a hard time replicating the arguments completely. But I think in the light of, I feel like the argument would essentially follow the line that some people can view this head of the Turing machine not as an explicit part of the world, but as something that's hidden in the physics of the world. So essentially, in the case of a quine, the description somehow both contains the means, or the description of the means, and the actual content of the quine. So it is a full-fledged replicator, but it becomes very nuanced. It becomes this dispute whether the head should be explicitly a part of the world. If it is, then I think we have a clear case for why, let's say, the VNSR construction is stronger. If the head is not a part of the world, then somehow there is no reason to explain why the head got copied. It's a part of the physics somehow. But the world is a bit strange. For instance, it has these non-deterministic laws. There are changes happening at locations that you cannot anticipate, whereas our world, let's say, changes are happening everything in parallel based on the state of the system. Yeah. It's time to move on. So, one more, let's say, honorable mention when it comes to the series of works on evolving self-replicators is definitely the work of Niels Baricelli, who was half Norwegian, half Italian. And he was the first person ever to perform computer simulations of artificial systems with evolving self-replicators in 1953. So if we claim that Langton was the father of artificial life, then I think Baricelli and von Neumann should be the grandfathers of artificial life. Though it is somehow, it is not really well known, the work of Baricelli. So let's correct that. And the history is really quite interesting. So Baricelli was a lecturer at the University of Oslo in physics, but he was also interested in symbiogenesis and, let's say, evolution of self-replicators. And he started his first experiments on paper, but he clearly saw the potential of using electronic computers to scale such simulations up. So he actually applied to the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton to the group of von Neumann, which was a group which had one of the first general fully electronic computers, to come as a researching visitors to simulate these systems. And it was a successful application. So essentially he had night shifts. And in contrast, during the day, these computers were really used for works related to the national defense. And at night, Botticelli was able to run self-replicating creatures on the exact same computers. So let's just quickly go over how his model works. Again, the world consists of a one-dimensional tape of cells indexed by integers. And at this point, each cell actually can be an integer itself. And the dynamics is again given by an update rule, which has 3 key ingredients: movement, replications, and dealing with collisions, which also somehow entails mutations. So, how does it work? Let's say we have a population in this one-dimensional configuration. So every empty space is essentially 0. Zeros are somehow equivalent to the quiescent state. And then just to have everything a bit more readable, this is actually a -3. So minus numbers will be denoted by underlined numbers. Movement is pretty straightforward. Essentially, this is what the organism predicts about itself. So a 1 is going to move in the next time step into the cell that is one distance away from its original position. So again, 5 also moves in this direction, and then the negative numbers move in the opposite direction. So they move to the left. Hopefully this is clear. The second step is enabling replication through some kind of cooperation of cells, actually. So here we have an example of this 2 moving into a location which used to have this -3 one-time step before. And in such a case, we use this previous value to actually enable this 2 to replicate, and the position where it replicates is influenced by this, let's say, second ancestor, and the position is calculated by taking the position of the original parent and shifting it by the number of values that is given by this co-parent, let's say. Is this clear? Perfect. And lastly, we somehow have to deal with collisions. So there can be collisions of 3 types. One type is if 2 cells that are just moving, that they collide. So in this case, multiple things can happen. Essentially, Botticelli studied a whole series of update rules. But let's say for our purpose of the exercises, we can say that in such a case, the collision is resolved by annihilation. The second type of collision is between, let's say, an original organism that just wants to move and an organism that wants to replicate into the same cell. So here this 2 had originally is like moved into a position with -1, so it wants to replicate to this position, which is -1 from its original one. And in this case, we can, for instance, say that the cell that wants to move has priority over the cell that wants to replicate. So we just say this is a -4. And the last type of collision we have not discussed is if 2 offsprings want to replicate into the same cell. This is where it can become interesting. Let's say for our purposes, we also just say that we just resolve this by annihilation. But Botticelli explained or experimented with mutations. So if 2 cells want to self-replicate into the same spot, they can, for instance, become an average of the 2, or they can somehow further modify themselves in certain ways, or even undergo random mutations. And what's interesting is that this is essentially the space-time diagram, with the original row being the topmost one, and there is a certain color coding of the integers. So I think typically the red hues are for positive and the green hues are for negative numbers, or the other way around. And you could see that there is like it's pretty fascinating. Just through these simple rules, he observed the emergence of higher level organisms that can actually self-replicate, and they consist of many more cells. They can even kind of be in parasitical relationships to each other. And eventually, after this initial transient, interesting region where they kind of compete and evolve, it usually stabilizes into some, let's say, most successful species that just propagate through the grid. Once you introduce mutations, you can get even more long-lived, interesting behavior. He even suggested that you can have some kind of competition of the organisms, that if they collide, they kind of perform some rock, paper, scissors, or computing some simple task competition. So you can really experiment with this model, which really preceded Tierra or Avida by almost 50 years. So that's pretty fascinating. And the last topic to very briefly touch upon is that all this is, yes?
Is this again cyclic?
I think here, yes. Yeah, and for practical purposes, you can either have a cyclic grid or initiate everything around some finite region with zeros. Yeah, so this is which we will only very briefly touch upon, is that in all the systems we have discussed so far, the initial generation of self-replicators was very carefully handcrafted by the designers of these worlds. And then what was observed was what happens later as these organisms propagate and interact and in some cases evolve. But one of the most fascinating open problems for biology also is how can these self-replicators emerge from simpler components that don't necessarily are able to replicate on their own. And there are a few works that do, let's say, explore this. How can the first replicators emerge? Though in most cases, we could kind of oversimplify and say that essentially the recipe is usually as follows. It is to design a system where the replicators are small enough such that they are able to be randomly guessed or sampled by the initial ridge dynamics, and as soon as they are, they will propagate. And it is unclear whether some mechanisms will dramatically increase the probability of the first replicators to emerge, but it is a very meaningful pursuit for the field of artificial life. So let's mention one example. In the realm of cellular automata, there are other works which deal with the emergence of self-replicators in program soups, but let's look at cellular automata for now. And let's look at the work of Cho and Regia again. So here you can see, this is a figure from their original paper, of a very small loop of size 3 by 3. And under this, and they essentially design a cellular automaton where such a loop can self-replicate. And in some sense, it is very extreme. Essentially, the smallest loop that can self-replicate in this world is just 4 cells, 4 non-quiescent cells. Here you can see its self-replication cycle. But they don't stop here. They, let's say, upgrade the system by introducing certain growth states. So if a particular loop has a certain state in the growth state, it's gonna potentially produce an offspring which has size 1 cell larger, let's say, than itself. So that's one interesting property. So essentially what happens is that if you have a cell that keeps on multiplying and lives in a world with some debris that is left behind on the configuration, some interactions with this debris can cause the cell to trigger one state into the growth state, and then it will produce an offspring of larger size. So this is a world where we can actually observe loops of growing sizes on a regular basis. So that's one thing they introduce, let's say the possibility to grow. And also there is a certain possibility to die. So if the genome is not completely correct and the loop fails to replicate, it is somehow able to dissolve and just leave some debris behind, but let's say free space for future organisms. And now the trick, the final trick is that essentially you can envision the state space of this cellular automaton to be a Cartesian product. So every state you can see here can be can be toggled in 2 regimes, either an unbounded regime or a bounded regime. And if you initialize the whole system with states that are in the unbounded regime, essentially the authors just define that in that region or in that scenario, the cellular automaton will just simulate game of life. Essentially, every non-quiescent state will be viewed as alive, every quiescent state will be viewed as dead. And if a state is supposed to survive or be born, then it's just pseudo-randomly determined to be some non-quiescent state. So essentially, in this part of the Cartesian product of the state space, the CA just mimics game of life behavior in some sense, or could be coarse-grained to do so, if we just forget the different non-quiescent states and represent them by a single alive cell. But here's the trick. Because we kind of assume that a game of life has rich dynamics and explores a wide variety of patterns, it will happen with some non-trivial probability that if we run the simulation long enough, there will eventually arise a sequence of 4 cells that form the simplest, smallest 2x2 replicator. And because this replicator is so small that every cell has complete awareness of all of the other cells in this organism, it can suddenly toggle itself to be in the bounded state. So it essentially switches its state from the unbounded to bounded. And in the bounded part of the rule table state space, the system will start simulating this self-replicating CA that the authors design. So the loop will start replicating. The cells around it will still mimic game of life, but as this cell replicates, it's going to produce more and more bounded states. So essentially, the regime will slowly switch into the self-replicating CA regime. So it's kind of a nice trick to, let's say, have some initial phase where we kind of initialize the system with only these unbounded states. And this phase is, let's say, this quasi-random exploration where we just hope that game of life will eventually spawn this 2x2 replicator somewhere. And as soon as it does, this replicator will, let's say, propagate through the system and create more and more copies. And as it will interact with other structures in the space, it could potentially grow and diversify. And this is indeed what happens. And here we just see a graph from their paper where as you kind of simulate the system more and more, there are actually, the average size of the loop keeps on increasing in some waves. So it's pretty interesting. But let's say it's a bit of a trick of how to sample or randomly guess the first replicators. And I think that summarizes it for today. If you would like, not this. We can watch a 1990s documentary about Race Tierra, which has such a strong 1990s aesthetic that it is worth watching just for that reason. Maybe we can use these 3 minutes. I will show you a little bit. So that you can find this freely online. It's a pretty fun 10-minute watch. So just to summarize, I think this is essentially... This concludes the part, which was a pretty large chunk of this course, about self-replication. And indeed, this last lecture felt really like a lecture in artificial biology. But as you have seen, there are so many notions that are essentially left to be formalized, that before we can truly understand the biology of artificial life, we should focus on understanding the physics of artificial life. And this is where the next part of the course will come in. And we will focus on studying the actual dynamical systems that underline these self-replicating creatures. And we will especially focus on cellular automata. So starting from next week, we will have more Blackboard lectures showing some classical results regarding cellular automata dynamics and computations and what is the interplay between the two. So that's it.